This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues.
And how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we're very fortunate to be joined by a highly regarded scholar, popular writer, and really, I think, someone who's doing some of the most interesting investigations of history and society in the United States today. This is Jill Lepore. Jill and I have overlapped, I think, a few times in different places, but it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to talk to her today. Jill is the David Woods Kemper Class of 41 Professor of American History at Harvard University. She's also a staff writer at The New Yorker. I'm sure many of you have read and seen many of her articles there. And she's the author of many prize-winning and best-selling books. I can't name them all. I'm just going to name my four favorite. The Name of War, King Philip's War and the Origins of American Identity, which was Jill's first book and I think her dissertation originally. New York Burning, Liberty, Slavery, and Conspiracy in 18th-Century Manhattan, a book that taught me a lot about the city I grew up in. The Secret History of Wonder Woman, which I think is a real hoot to read. And then These Truths, A History of the United States, which is Professor Lepore's most recent book, and the book we'll be talking a bit about today. Welcome to our podcast, Jill.
Hey, thanks so much, Jeremy. Fun to be here.
Before we turn to our discussion with Jill Lepore, we have, of course, Mr. Zachary's poem. What's your title of your poem today?
An American History.
Let's hear it.
In the moments when they toss the tea off the arrogant boats and watch the harbor turn brown and golden in the dawn light, they were not really saying no as much as they were saying listen. And in the excruciating dullness of the hallowed halls where they felt out in the still summer air the future they never imagined to be more than 10, maybe 20 years, they didn't see the moment as a prophecy or the product of some divinity. They were people. These were their ideals. If you want to escape history, be a seagull. If you want to make history, be a porcupine. In these moments, we are porcupines. We build ourselves an armor that sprouts from our own skin. And then again, one morning, we wake up seagulls and we float out to sea on the drifting breeze and circle the great blue nothingness so we don't have to look back, so we can fly to the paradise on the other side. We have made our own history, and we have tried to escape it. But there is only one truth to history, and it is simply that there is no going back. There is no starting over again at the beginning. Even the dead get gravestones, and the living walk solemnly past and place rocks in neat lines along the top so they can feel below that the world in all its vain existence is still there, and that gravity is still pulling us towards and away from each other at the same time. May we all have the courage to accept this fact so we can say with confidence when the time comes, I have made my own history, and, like a true American, I have done my utmost to outlive it.
I love the punchline, Zachary. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about the ways in which we as Americans have this very not overblown, but very grandiose sense of our own history. But at the same time, we remain so ignorant of so many aspects of it. And it's almost intentional, the way that we view our history. But there is also this overwhelming sense of optimism that I think is what makes the United States so attractive, or at least endearing.
Jill, what I love about your work, and particularly your most recent book, These Truths, is like Zachary's poem. I mean, you meditate on many of the difficult parts of our history. Slavery is at the center of your history, but yet it is optimistic. You seem to believe that we can find a history and a way of telling that history that will bring us all together. Can you say more about that?
I think that's a forced optimism. Thank you for the lovely poem, Zachary. I was really stirred by it, and I love the seagull and the porcupine in particular. I have buried many a dead porcupine. I have dogs who are porcupine hunters, and this ends badly for all, one and all. So I have an intimate acquaintance with the life cycle of a porcupine.
Very good.
Once wrote about a great deal about porcupines. So it kind of means something to me. Also, porcupines are just such a funny American phenomenon.
Yes.
To answer your question, Jeremy, I had been very uninterested in writing this book, right? Taking on the task of trying to write a synthetic account of all of American history. And I was asked to do it for a college edition. And my publisher, Norton, has a big college, the best college division. And they wanted to have a new single author U.S. history book. And I just thought that sounded like really the worst possible writing assignment. And I would say I am chiefly a writer. I'm incidentally a historian. But I would write about anything and often do. I don't always write history. And then I felt this real burden about that refusal, that it really bothered me that I didn't think there was a good single author trade book in particular. The textbooks are usually teams of writers and they don't often really make a whole lot of sense. And they're generally a misery to read. So I wanted to try to write this actual, a book, not a textbook. And knew, though, that this hadn't really been attempted for generations. My generation, our generation, since the 1960s, right? The idea of writing a single author, synthetic, sweeping narrative history of the United States was utterly untenable. And for a long time, it just would have been wholly irresponsible, right? So starting in the 1960s, when women and people of color entered the academy, got PhDs, became professors, went into the archives, did amazing work, wrote articles and monographs, and it pretty much exploded the scholarship of American history. And what they were interested in was conflict among groups. Excavating the history of the group to which they belonged, often, most cases, like founding women's history and Black history, Chicano history. And wonderfully excavating archival sources and telling stories that had never been told before, but very much invested in that redemptive work, right? Just redeeming from the obscurity of history, at least within academic history. I don't mean in a more moral sense, but that vision for the urgency and importance of that work was involved the complete dismissal of the possibility of anyone doing anything sweeping or synthetic, right? You couldn't really care about indigenous history and pretend to be writing a national history. Those two things were just opposed to one another, right? Like indigenous peoples in the Americas are their own nations. Like how could you include them? It would just be an act itself of colonization to put them in a national history. Right. So they're just really profound intellectual and also deep political objections to that very idea of the project. And when I was coming up and getting trained, that's what everybody was trained with. But that meanwhile, out there in the world, outside of academic institutions and K through 8 and high school classrooms, people have to teach national history.
Sure.
It's required by state legislatures. And so curricular material was being developed and made, and is increasingly, as school budgets were plummeting, school teachers were using kind of the cheapest thing that was out there, which is going to just tend to be really kooky, triumphalist, non-academic, in fact, specifically anti-intellectual, right? So eventually this wore me down. And I realized, in spite of, on the one hand, scholars thinking this is an untenable and indefensible intellectual project, so in spite of that, the need that seemed to be a felt need for the general public to have a meaningful new interpretation that attempted, there's a lot of original work in there, but it's obviously really, I'm synthesizing the work of generations of incredible scholars who've done this work. Like I read a lot of books to write this book, It seemed to me it was worth a try to say, this is actually work that academic historians ought to be doing. Mm-hmm. And it's not meant to be the last word. It's meant to, an idea I had in doing it was to attempt to rekindle a tradition whereby at a certain kind of point in your writing life as an academic historian, one might take on the obligation to attempt to write a sweeping synthesis of the nation's past. Right. So that's what I tried to do. Do I think that it itself brings people together or is a testament to my personal optimism, I think it can easily be read that way, because that was probably intended on my part to kind of, it has there are a number of principled calls to civic responsibility within the text itself. So I don't mean to gainsay my own words, but just to say, even in the years since I wrote that book, things have gotten a lot messier.
Right. But you do say early on, actually 2 or 3 times in a really wonderful introduction, which is unique for a grand narrative, because you struggle with the idea of a grand narrative in your introduction. But you do say a few times, I have tried to cross a divide. And I'm curious, what you think that is, because many people would say that often with different politics from you and different politics from me, they would say, we need a certain kind of traditional history because it's what brings us together. Mm-hmm. You seem to make the argument here that at least there's a possibility that a different kind of history, a non-traditional history, that's still attentive to Ben Franklin, you write a lot about him in here, right? Could bring us together. You can cross a divide. So what do you mean by that? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, our account of the nation's past is as polarized as our politics are. And that's an untenable situation for a nation, for a national people, right? There needs to be some sense of a shared past to be able to, because that's the foundation with which one looks ahead, right? And maybe these things seem kind of commonplace and obvious now, because we're in the middle of these crazy schoolroom history wars with you can't teach this and you must teach that. But I don't think that was as obvious even to most people just a few years ago, because the stakes weren't completely clear. But for a long time now, certainly since, for a very long time, but certainly since, let's say, the 1990s, the stories that Americans tell about the nation's past have been diverging, right? So there's this very very conservative traditional account that really dates to the 1950s and is a very whitewashed version of American history. And then there's a quite radical, in which America has never done any wrong, right? And then there's another, to the far left, an account. We might associate this with sort of Howard Zinn in the 70s.
A people's history.
And maybe with 1619 Project now, right? Where the story of American history is a litany of atrocity, right? American, and in the matter of foreign policy, America's never done anything good. Maybe you could associate the right with, do you remember when Newt Gingrich had to renew American civilization? He had this video cassette lecture series.
I have tried to forget that. I cannot forget it. It was so bad.
So Gingrich had a PhD in history, and he fashioned himself very much, or especially early in his congressional career, as the history professor, member of Congress. And he packaged and sold with some significant influence. I think we have not yet begun to measure the influence of his American history curriculum. But so, on the one hand, on the one side you have that, and the other side, like a generation ago you had Zinn maybe. And to be sure, there's some truth in both of those accounts. But there's no it's an impoverished political community when kids in some school districts are reading the ones. Kids, how can they even have a conversation? They're not the same country. Right. Now, I mean, there doesn't need to be a uniformity, right? Like God forbid we lived in a nation state that said, here is the nation's history, everyone must agree to it, right? Like that is a terrible injustice as well. But the fact that, history is a body of inquiry that relies on scholarship that is constantly churning and making new discoveries, that's the piece that is interesting as a matter of pedagogy, right? So crossing a divide is to say this is a book in which you will find just a very long litany of atrocities. And you will also find a tremendous amount of beauty and triumph and invention and generosity, the kind of, beacon of light that in the brightest of times the nation has understood itself to be, and its best moral and most moral political actors have in fact been. I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive, but it is a less, it's a way less sexy thing to be the book that is on the one hand, but also on the other hand. That is a despised form of moderation politically, right? And I think there's increasingly very little place for that within academic life.
Right.
Maybe you would disagree with that. I'd be curious to hear.
No, I actually agree with that. And I think like the rest of our society, it's much easier to label than it is to explain. And we do a lot of labeling as scholars also of in-groups and out-groups. And I don't think that necessarily maps onto our politics, but oftentimes it does map onto our politics. I was struck in this book and in your scholarship as a whole. You were trained as a colonial early Americanist. I see your work as a public intellectual, as someone who's trying not just to cross divides, but to get us to think about how we can believe in the truths that you highlight here: equality, sovereignty, democracy, but also be conscious of slavery. Be conscious of the exclusions in our society, the mistreatment of Native peoples that you've written a lot about. How do you see those things coming together when you talk to audiences about our history? You revere Ben Franklin. You've written so much about him. There's a big section. I don't want to give away the whole book, but I hope people will read the book to read more about Ben Franklin. He's in here. But then you also spend a lot of time on slavery. How do you explain those worlds together?
Yeah, I don't need to be fussy, but I wouldn't say I revere Ben Franklin. I find him very funny, mostly because he's filthy. Like he's just the most filthy of the framers. I find him an incredible companion on the page.
And you make him fascinating to the reader. I will say.
I find him fascinating, but that's largely because I wrote a biography of his sister Jane. So I spent a lot of time with the Franklins many years ago, many years with them. I guess I would say, the sort of grotesque version, and Zachary, you're close enough to this age-wise that maybe you've encountered this. There is a kind of like middle grades U.S. history textbook that is like la-di-da-di-da, and then this, and then this, and then there's like a sidebar, and it's like, and also slavery.
Right, yes.
Or like,
yes.
And there's a sidebar, and like, oh, Plains Indian warfare, now they're all, and you just kind of la-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da. Oh, the Industrial Revolution had some losers. They're losers, though. La-di-da, like it's a weird, there's like the one narrative, and then it doesn't even rise to the level of a subplot. It's almost like a stagey aside, like a whispered aside. Oh yes, slavery. And like as if, and of course, slavery is an economic system. It is a political system. It is an act of war. It is many things. It is a social experience. It is a series of acts of repeated violence. It is an inherited stuff. Like there's a lot in the institution that requires examination, and the way architecturally my book works. And the reason that I think the sidebar, even if the sidebar is like, if it's the inverse, right? If it's like, oh, this terrible. Okay, but maybe there was, the Atlantic Charter had some good ideas in it, but terrible. Like either way, it's a craziness because it's the waxing and the waning. It's the warp and the woof, like those things. So the way my book works is to suggest, following decades of really vital scholarship, back to Edmund Morgan, American Slavery, American Freedom, that slavery is not incidental to liberty. It is, in fact, the world's first modern democracy arises in the last bastion of chattel slavery because enslaving other human beings, fully depriving them of their liberty and indeed down to their lives for the sake of exerting wholly arbitrary power over other human beings, causes people to think differently about the nature of liberty. And it's a brutal truth, right? It's grotesque. It is a horror to imagine that it is the fact of these Virginia planters, Jefferson among them, Washington among them, Madison among them, who come to hold liberty dear because they have so deprived other human beings of it. But so you can't just do a sidebar there. Like the one is a cause of the other, and yet it doesn't end, right? Like it keeps rolling because then the fact of that advocacy for liberty and the struggle for independence generates and strengthens and fuels and amplifies voices of abolitionism and makes possible emancipation ultimately, right? Mm-hmm. But so they're constantly in tension with one another. You can't. It's just a very weird thing that there are history books out there that want to have the animating force. Like, what causes change?
Right.
Just one thing. Like, it can't be when actually there's just a lot going on.
Right. Zachary.
One of the things I think you were just acknowledging there is sort of the vastness of American history, the ways in which we have these many causes and the many effects. And certainly American history can seem vast when we have it in a middle school textbook that's 1,000 pages long. But how do we get Americans to understand how small our history is in the span of the world? And how do we get Americans to understand that the United States is still a relatively new project, right? One where creativity and iteration is still, if not possible, needed and required.
Yeah. No, that's a beautiful sentiment. And I wish I felt that it were within the realm of the possible at this moment.
Right.
I mean, I do think that, you might wonder to yourself, did landing on the moon, which you think you would have thought could imbue humanity and Americans who in fact, went on that voyage with a kind of newfound sense of awe and wonder at the smallness of us within the vastness of the universe. But it could go the other way too, right? There could be just this incredible, well, then of course there would be a celebration, in fact, was of the technological feat and scientific advances that made that journey possible, that could have a kind of icky triumphalism, a kind of we've now won the Cold War because we got first to the moon. Like, there could be this kind of way in which the beauty and majesty of that act becomes diminished by the kind of seedy political maneuvering of it all, right? And it's going to be both, right? So, you could think that what that sense of humility and awe and wonder as against all of human history, you almost would expect that the daily number of climate catastrophes around the world would bring that home in a way. It gives us a sense of scale, right? Of the scale of species on Earth, of the number of species on Earth, of our place among other species. But I don't see that happening, right? Like, I think the climate becomes another thing to win. That it's a matter of national security. We should, in fact, now invest in climate. The language with which it's going to be cloaked is going to be one that comes very close to a kind of ugly version of nationalism. So I guess I love the idea behind your question, but I don't think that can be found in history. I think that is a matter of faith and the sacred and how we live our lives as humans. And I don't think there's a mandate from the past of any country or any people that can answer that. And in some ways, you could argue, looking at history, that seeking that in the history of a particular group will always lead only to bad things.
It's interesting you say that. I read your book slightly differently, but of course I was reading in it what I wanted to read, I guess. But I was looking back through it on the plane last night as I was flying back to Austin. And what struck me is that, in a sense, this is your most political of all your books. I'm a political historian. I usually don't think of you as a political historian. And here you are writing a wonderful political history. That's what I would call this, political history of the United States. And you have at every moment from the founding forward, you have beauty and ugliness. Mm-hmm. Again, back to the American Revolution, you capture, I think, so well the world of Edmund Morgan and popular sovereignty, the invention of popular sovereignty. You capture that, right? You capture the idealism. But I think you say at some point, right, it's two revolutions and one loses. The revolution against slavery, even though slaves, you say, are leaving the plantation at this time, they're fleeing to the British side, right? And I think throughout, and so I came away thinking, well, we shouldn't be surprised that today we have the beauty of the largest peaceful movement in our society for racial justice after the killing of George Floyd. More people were protesting peacefully, more white people than ever before in our society. But at the same time, we see a resurgence of anti-Semitism, of racism, of all these things. Mm-hmm. And it sort of was a little comforting for me, maybe it shouldn't have been, that we're sort of in a cycle we've been in for a long time.
It's interesting. It's so interesting you say that, because when the book came out, which was in 2018, I got a really weird and revealing and quite common email just every few days, every few weeks, saying, "I've just finished your book, and I just can't understand how you were able to write it so fast since Trump was elected and explain everything about how Trump came to power." When I read Stephen Douglas saying, our government was founded by white men for white men and their descendants for all of posterity, I was amazed that you had been able to find that so quickly in order to explain to me the origins of Trumpism. And what? Like, it's a 1,000-page book, lady. Like, I didn't write it since 2016. Like this is like lecture material I was giving in 1992.
Right,
you know what I mean? Like, it's a compilation of anything I've ever read or said.
Yeah, it's cumulative, as all of our books
written.
are. Right.
Yeah. But I would also hear people what I would sort of say when I go give talks, and I would kind of tell this story. I'd say, like, when I started writing the book, when I laid it out in outline, I always planned to end. I figured the book would come out around 2019, and I always planned to end with Obama's inauguration in 2009. It's a beautiful moment. It was a beautiful day. It's a lovely ending for a book about American history. It was going to be a beautiful scene to set, and it would be like the curtain closes and people are weeping on the mall. The end.
Right. It's a fairy tale.
And I knew that by the time the book came out, the election of 2016 was going to have happened. But like everybody else, it seemed like from the polls that Hillary Clinton was going to win. I didn't really care. Like, I wasn't going to tack on a chapter about Hillary Clinton. I had nothing to say about that. And you would not, as a historian, really want to be commenting on the very recent past, typically. So it's like, okay, that'll be comfortable. The book come out like 2019. It'll be writing about an event. It'll end in 2009. At least be 10 years in the past, comfortable. And then Trump was elected, and I had to kind of scramble. I realized I needed to write an additional chapter that got to Election Day 2016. Which is the last thing in the world I wanted to do.
Right.
Try to explain Trumpism when no one really still understands it analytically in a deep and meaningful way that can be persuasive to everybody. And it's a tough ending. It is a tough ending to end on Election Day. But that seemed to me clear would be like a dereliction of professional duty not to include that. The book would come out and people would be like, oh, she must just love Obama. She ended in 2009. Like, why'd she not cover Trump? And I'm like, that would be the only thing people would say about the book, like, after all that work.
Right.
The textbook edition is finally coming out now, and it ends. Guess where it ends, Zachary?
I don't know. 2009?
No.
Earlier?
January 6th, 2021.
It ends with the insurrection.
Yeah. That's where my new book starts, actually. Yeah.
I mean, it's but how do you, it's a moment. It's the moment. It's like
it's a culmination of so much.
Carry it forward a little bit. Yeah. That's where you have to go. It's really also a really tough ending.
You have a wonderful paragraph in your epilogue that I've read and reread many times. It's near the very end. The truths on which the nation was founded, equality, sovereignty, and consent, which are sort of themes that run through the book, those are these truths, had been retold after the Civil War. Modern liberalism came out of that political settlement, and the United States, abandoning isolationism, had carried that vision to the world. This echoes themes we've covered in many of our podcasts. The rule of law, individual rights, democratic government, open borders, and free markets. The fight to make good on the promise of the nation's founding truths held the country together for a century during the long struggle for civil rights. And yet the nation came apart all the same, all over again. Is that still your diagnosis as a historian for where we are?
Yeah. Yeah, man. It's only getting worse. Do you think it's worse from 2016?
I don't know.
Probably when I wrote that.
I don't know. Zachary, what do you think?
Is our history getting worse? I don't know.
Are we coming apart?
I don't think so. I think we've probably been apart for a long time. But I think it's interesting. You talk in there about the power of the United States as an ideal, if not a reality, or as a journey, if not an actually attainable goal. I wonder, is there an argument to be made that maybe our founding was a different moment? Maybe it was simply unique to the a sort of unique historical moment that didn't necessarily have the philosophical or the or the governmental impact worldwide that we maybe project onto it today from the lens of 2022. I'm thinking particularly, I think one of your colleagues in The New Yorker, Adam Gopnik, wrote a piece a few years ago, I think it was 2017, about sort of comparing actually the Canadian system to the United States, and sort of asking if you compare the sort of the ideal of a multiracial, or at least popular sovereignty based government in Canada and the United States, maybe the Canadian system actually better embodies those ideas. I don't know. That may have been 3 questions in one. I apologize.
Yeah. No, I can buy that. I can be persuaded of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that founding a country on the idea of natural rights and the consent of the governed is an extraordinary act in human history. And when commentators at the time, said there was the creation of the earth, and there was when Christ came to earth, and then there was the discovery of the Americas by Europeans, and then there was the founding of the world's first modern, what became the world's first modern. Like that, these are the main events. Like that's the epic chroniclers of the 19th century, and their self-satisfied celebrations. But so I would nowhere go that far, and that would not be my list about the signal events in the history of humankind. But it is a huge event. That does it mean that does it follow that the experiment conducted here is the one that has gone the best? Absolutely not. That just doesn't follow. And there are really great comparisons. A scholar I really admire immensely, Jamal Green, who teaches at Columbia Law School, he once did this sort of interesting U.S.-Canadian comparison, which was, he was really interested in why Americans were so easily persuaded by the jurisprudence of originalism, the idea that there is a kind of original meaning to the Constitution and we need to be faithful to it. Right. It's like, that's such a weird idea. So he looked at other former British colonies that have written constitutions. So he compared the U.S., Canada, Australia, mainly them, and looked at all these different indices, like, I don't know, income inequality, literacy rates, like what could maybe account for this real difference. And it was the percentage of the population that was evangelical Protestants. That form of fundamentalism, a fundamentalist reading of a text as scripture, is just very widely diffused in our culture. Even among those of us who are not evangelical Protestants, we live in a world of evangelical Protestantism, and so it seems just very natural. It was kind of like an easy sell to convince Americans, which really only happened since the 1970s, that the Constitution needs to work that way. And Canada doesn't have that, right? And when you don't have this burden on your back, carrying this incredible weight of this unamendable, unchangeable Constitution, where we have this weird deformity with the Supreme Court, you have a capacity for kind of a pluralist politics, a kind of harmonious politics that we just completely lack.
Sure, we have a priesthood that restricts that. They just wear black robes of a different kind. So final question, Jill. It's the question we ask every week to our various wonderful guests. What should we take away from this, especially our young listeners, on how history can help them navigate our democratic future, assuming that we all believe, you point out in the book, not everyone has always believed this, but I think we all believe, at least rhetorically, in democracy. And I think you and I in particular, and Zachary, because we all love history and we've devoted ourselves to it, we believe that history somehow enriches our understanding of democracy. What would you hope that your young readers and listeners are taking from your work to help them enrich their democratic story?
Yeah, well, I would hope that people could think of history as an ocean where instead of, dropping in a line and trying to catch the fish that supports the view you already have and throwing all the other fish back in, that you can just go sail and explore, that it is a world open to discovery. There will be serious storms out there. There will be beautiful sunrises out there. There will be buffeting winds and there will be gentle winds. But it is not there to justify your position in the world. It is actually, people lived and died and they suffered and they endured and they are gone, and you can honor them best by appreciating the complexity of their lives and not using them as political tools.
Zachary, what do you think?
I think that's very powerful. I think maybe that's what we need as a country right now is an acknowledgement that we are all shaped by things as a society and collectively that we didn't choose, that we had no say in, but that continue to define our lives. And maybe that is the humility we need, and that's the humility we're missing.
And I love the metaphor of sailing at sea. It's an adventure, and the winds are taking you in directions you don't expect. I think of your writing in that way. I mean, what's so beautiful about your writing, Jill, is you go from Wonder Woman to Ben Franklin's sister to John Winthrop, who's in here. You cover so much territory, following, as you say, the different winds of the evidence and the stories. And I think there's a lot we can take from that. There's a humility and an appreciation, I think, of those around us. That doesn't make you optimistic, Jill?
No, I'm sorry. I don't have a lot of optimism to offer, but I just to say, be a seagull.
Be a seagull. Well, this has been a fascinating and wonderful conversation. Thank you for joining us today,
Thanks
Jill.
You both.
Zachary, thank you for your poem, and thank you most of all to our loyal listeners for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.